catch me howling at the moon.
What's up guys, and welcome back to Park Pros. Today I have a trip report from Carowinds, the Cedar Fair park located on the border of North and South Carolina, just outside of Charlotte. My visit to Carowinds was on Memorial Day 2021 and was the third park of my Southeast road trip with my buddy Andrew, who's the owner of the Instagram account Peak Adrenaline. Before I give my thoughts on Carowinds, I want to preface this video by saying that this was by far my most stressful theme park day of 2021. Carowinds was a brand new park for both Andrew and I, so we had the difficult task of trying to get on as many of the 14 coasters at the park as we could, while also making sure we had enough time to get footage and get re-rides on the top coasters. And with the park open for just 8 hours this particular day, we had a very thin margin of error for this visit. So just a warning, if this review isn't all sunshine and rainbows from me, just know that the stress of that day probably played a little bit of a factor on my impressions of this park. Now you're probably wondering about the title of this video, which we'll go into detail about later. But first, let's start this trip report off with a lightning round of my thoughts on the roller coaster lineup of Carowinds. I already talked a little bit about several of these coasters in my top 15 new coasters of 2021 video a couple weeks ago, but I'll try to offer some unique thoughts here. We strategically started off the day with Ricochet, the park's wild mouse, because we figured the ride would probably get a long line throughout the day, and that ended up being a very wise decision. And it was fine, just your typical wild mouse. Next, we headed back to Copperhead Strike before the line picked up, and this mock multi-launch coaster ended up being my second favorite in the park by a pretty wide margin. This ride is just so much fun, and while the launches aren't that intense or fast, the ride has some great whippy transitions, solid ejector airtime, and of course that phenomenal hang time. Just an all-around good time from a manufacturer that I hope Cedar Fair will continue to work with frequently in the future. Trying to get more of the low capacity rides out of the way, next we hit Flying Cobras, the park's Vekoma Boomerang. And I like this one. It's got the new vest restraints, so it's not really uncomfortable, which was a pleasant surprise. Next up on our credit hunt was Woodstock Express, the PTC family wooden coaster. Not much to say on this one, except that I'm really glad that Cedar Fair has kept all these family woodies in good shape. I think they're a nice step up from the smaller Steel Kitty coasters for the young thrill seekers. Next was Vortex, which was surprisingly pretty good. I used to ride Iron Wolf all the time at my home park, so I was expecting the same level of roughness from Vortex, but it turned out to be decently smooth and kind of had a cool layout. Carolina Cyclone was bad. One of the roughest aero loopers I've been on, with some harsh and uncomfortable transitions. Carolina Gold Rusher was okay. It's not very memorable, and I kinda completely forgot everything about it until I just rewatched the POV. It just doesn't really do much, and when a mine train doesn't do much, you kinda hope that the thematic elements might make up for it, and this one doesn't really have much of anything. Afterburn is very good. It has a pretty unique layout for a B&M invert, and its great pacing makes it really intense. I love the tunnels and how it sits up on a hill and interacts with the surrounding trees. And I'd guess that based on its location tucked in the back of the park, it probably doesn't get much of a line. This sits comfortably in the top half of the B&M inverts I've been on. Intimidator is pretty solid. I was having a lot of fun with it in the first half of the ride, and I thought it had some pretty good elements and floater airtime. But it has one of the weakest endings to a roller coaster of all time. This last portion of track is just entirely pointless. It is pretty weak for a B&M hyper, but still a fun coaster overall. Hurler was okay. Definitely not as unbearably rough as I expected it to be, but it just doesn't really do a whole lot outside of like one or two surprisingly decent airtime moments. I know Cedar Fair doesn't really do clones, but a Twisted Timbers clone here would give Carowinds an unbelievable top 5 coasters. And pairing Fury with an RMC quite literally right next to each other would be a Maverick Vengeance level duo for Carowinds. Either that, or just tear Hurler down and put in a GCI or something like a Gravity Group family coaster. This park is desperately lacking a decent modern wooden coaster in that lineup. Moving on to Fury 325, this is obviously the coaster that put Carowinds on the map and is the main draw to this park, and it did not disappoint. Fury deserves its own video review at some point on the channel, but let me just say that this is the best B&M in the world, and no question one of the best steel coasters in America. Just a spectacular, breathtaking ride, and in my opinion, completely lived up to my very high expectations coming in. We budgeted in about an an hour at the end of the day to get re-rides on this absolute machine of a ride, but unfortunately it got stuck on the lift hill when we got back in line and they ended up closing it for the day. But we still got 3 rides, all of which were in the front or the back seat, and I still can't decide which was better. This coaster all around is just as good as it gets. Finally, the last coaster we were able to get on was Kitty Hawk. These Vekoma hanging bangs are really nothing special, although this one does visually look very nice, and I like the corresponding theme with Nighthawk. Speaking of Nighthawk, that along with the Kiddie Coaster Wilderness Express were the 2 roller coasters we missed out on during this trip. Nighthawk is obviously one of the park's major coasters and a pretty rare model nowadays, so it was a little disappointing not to get on it. We had originally planned to hit it right away, but it didn't open up with the park, and so anytime this coaster was in my line of sight, I had my eyes glued to it for any signs of operation, because we knew it was gonna draw a massive line as soon as it opened. And sure enough, when we saw it cycle for the first time, we booked it over there, but it had already racked up a line no shorter than 90 minutes long, which we just didn't have time for. And that's not even considering that the ride had to be running one train, because by my count, they were dispatching a train about every 15 minutes or so throughout the day. And that is no exaggeration. And that conveniently leads us into our next topic, which is this park's operations. The ride operations at Carowinds were very strange, because depending on the ride, they were either really good or really bad. There was absolutely no in between at this park. So first, let's talk about the good. The Fury crew was one of, if not the best ride crew I've ever seen at a regional amusement park. They were consistently getting trains out every 45 seconds, and I don't think I ever saw a dispatch time longer than a minute. Fury was a station wait most of the day, despite it literally being a holiday. So big thumbs up to the Fury crew, which I hear always does a really nice job. Similarly, the Copperhead Strike crews were also getting trains out super quickly. Even though that ride doesn't have the craziest capacity, I never saw the line get longer than 15 to 20 minutes all day, which again is super impressive for the park's newest and probably second most popular coaster. But unfortunately, outside of those 2 anomalies, virtually every other ride had horrendously bad operations. Like, up there with some of the worst that I've ever seen. The entire time we waited for Intimidator, there wasn't a single cycle where the 3 trains they were operating weren't stacked. In other words, one train was loading in the station, one train was in the block section behind the station, and the 3rd train was sitting in the final brake run. According to RCDB, Intimidator has a duration of 3 minutes and 33 seconds, which means that the dispatch times on this particular day were no shorter than 3.5 minutes, which is pretty horrendous for a B&M hypercoaster, a ride model that is specifically designed for ease of operation that leads to a high throughput. Basically every other roller coaster, Afterburn, Carolina Cyclone, Hurler, Vortex, you name it, consistently had around 5-minute dispatch times. And in many instances, that's being generous. The operations at this park on this particular day were just astonishingly bad. So I'm not sure if Carowinds just assigns all of their experienced operators to Fury and Copperhead to at least make sure that those lines move quickly, which I guess would sort of make sense, but it was just really confusing to go from one coaster with really sharp and efficient operators to another rides crew that seemingly had no clue what they were doing. And yes, I know that the parks still have this kind of built-in excuse of having staffing issues because of COVID, but this is the last year we're doing that. We are not letting parks get away with that excuse in 2022. And I'm not putting the blame on any of the individual ride operators. If anything, it's the park's fault because they were clearly understaffed at many of the rides. We got lucky that the park didn't seem as slammed as they probably could have been on a holiday, because despite the operation, we did manage to knock out 12 of the 14 coasters while getting multiple rides on Fury, Afterburn, and Copperhead. And we actually tried to get another ride on Intimidator, but when we walked into line and saw that 3rd train sitting on the brake run, we turned right back around. Now that we have the operations out of the way, let me talk about some of the things that I liked about Carowinds. The park's front entrance and the walkway going into the park that Fury interacts with is just phenomenal. This is one of my favorite park entrances. I love that you can see the downtown Charlotte skyline from the top of Fury, and the ride's lift is basically facing right towards it, which is an amazing detail. I think the park does a decent job, especially towards the front entrance, emphasizing that the park spans 2 states. It's such a cool and unique aspect of Carowinds, and I almost wish you'd see more of it throughout the park. The Copperhead Strike area looks great, and I really like how Cedar Fair has been investing capital into completely renovating the areas around new rides that they install. But also, has anyone else noticed that Twisted Twisted Timbers, Mystic Timbers, and Copperhead Strike essentially all have the same theme, which is basically just rusted cars. Don't get me wrong, I do appreciate the theming, but would it kill you to be at least a little original, Cedar Fair? This next point is kind of hard to explain, so bear with me. When you're at Carowinds, it's evident that this is a park that the Cedar Fair chain has been pumping a lot of money into over the past several years. In a lot of ways, it feels like a slightly upgraded version of some of the lower tier Cedar Fair parks, but that's only because they have those 3 major coasters that are all relatively new. But you know how a Six Flags park just feels like a Six Flags park? In a similar way, Carowinds feels like the most corporate Cedar Fair park possible. In fact, it kind of feels like the average of all the Cedar Fair parks. I came away from my visit to Carowinds feeling like the park is missing just a little bit of charm and character. I think because Cedar Fair has renovated this park so much in the past 10 years, it feels just a little bit more corporate-y than all the other parks in the chain. At parks like Cedar Point and Knott's and even Dorney, you can feel the history and tradition shining through certain aspects of those parks. But I didn't really notice or feel any of that nostalgia at Carowinds. Now, before you Carowinds fanboys go nuclear on me in the comments, this is the reason I gave that disclosure to begin the video. When I go to a new park like this, I like to try and knock out as many of the coasters as I possibly can on the first visit, because the next time I visit Carowinds, I can just enjoy myself stress-free. So like I said, this was a stressful day where we were going non-stop in order to try and get everything done. So there's a better chance than not that I overlooked some aspects of the park and missed out on some of the details. But in spite of all that, I would most definitely classify Fury 325 as a PRC, which is a term that I literally just came up with, which stands for Park Redeeming Coaster, meaning that Fury is just so good, it covers up a lot of the park's blemishes. And I do think I'll be back to Carowinds sooner rather than later, because the few rides I got on Fury were definitely not enough to keep me away for very long. And to be honest, the next time I do visit, I doubt that I'll ride very much outside of the park's current big 4 coasters and the 2 credits that I'm missing. So in conclusion, I'm not quite sure what to make of Carowinds. It didn't blow me away, but it also wasn't a bad park by any means. Like I said, it kind of feels like the average Cedar Fair park. Keep in mind that this video is a trip report, which is my thoughts on this one particular visit. Certainly not my final or complete thoughts on the park. And even though a lot of what I talked about in this review may come across as negative, I did enjoy my day at Carowinds, and I left satisfied with how much I was able to get done. I think with just a few minor tweaks to the operations, this would be a great amusement park. That's all I got for my thoughts on Carowinds. If you've made it this far, please give the video a like and consider subscribing to Park Pros if you're new around here. Thank you guys for checking out the video, and we'll see you next time.